Today, Germany is a diverse country with a significant immigrant population from various backgrounds, including people of African descent. While challenges related to racism and discrimination persist, Germany has made efforts to address these issues and promote equality and inclusion for all its residents. With modern trade and migration, cities such as Frankfurt, Berlin, Munich, and Cologne, which were formerly centers of occupation forces following World War II, have substantial Afro-German communities now. As of 2020, in a country with a population of 83 million people, there were an estimated 1 million Afro-Germans. Quite impressive, isn't it? Anyone with a good knowledge of history would say, in relation to what it used to be, or rather what it was way back into the colonial era, way back into the transatlantic slave trade bloody times whence it all began. Germany's historical experiences with its black population have been marked by extreme discrimination, persecution, and even well-planned out attempts to eliminate them. However, this video comprehensively explores these events and provides an overview of the untellable cruelty faced by the black population throughout different periods in German history. And just while you are very welcome to join us, do kindly endeavor to hit that like button, share with family and friends, and subscribe if you are yet to. Now do take a walk with me. In the 16th century, the 1680s precisely, the Margraviate of Brandenburg, a major principality of the Holy Roman Empire from 1157 to 1806 that played a pivotal role in the history of Germany and Central Europe, then leading the broader realm of Brandenburg Prussia, pursued limited imperial efforts in West Africa. In May 1682, the German colonization of Africa began when the newly founded Brandenburg African Company, or the Brandenburger Gold Coast, which administered the colony that had just been granted a royal charter by Frederick William, Elector of Brandenburg, established a small West African colony consisting of 2 Gold Coast settlements on the Gulf of Guinea, around Cape 3 Points in the country today known as Ghana. These coasts were namely Gross Friedrichsburg, also called Hollandia, now Pokesu, which became the capital, and Fort Dorothea, also called Akada, now Aquida. The Brandenburger Gold Coast would later be renamed the Prussian Gold Coast Settlements in the year 1701, January 15th, in connection with the founding of the Prussian kingdom when Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia, crowned himself king in Prussia, after which he became known as Frederick I of Prussia. Prussia was the last major European power and first German state to enter transatlantic trade. It was relatively isolated from major European trade hubs at the time, so the incentive existed to enter transatlantic trade and fortify the Prussian economy. The Kingdom of Prussia was a German kingdom that constituted the state of Prussia between the years 1701 and 1918. It was the driving force behind the unification of Germany in 1866 and was the leading state of the German Empire until its dissolution in the year 1918. Although it took its name from the region called Prussia, it was based in the Margraviate of Brandenburg. Its capital was Berlin. However, the Gold Coast colony was initially founded for a series of reasons: to supply gold to an expanding European economy, to supply slaves for Prussia's entry in the human cargo trade, and to engage in gum arabic and ostrich feathers trade. Shortly after the founding of the colony, it was soon realized that the greatest profits could only be made from human cargo trade, as gold had eventually run scarce in the area, which was also due to overexploitation. So the focus of the colony was put almost exclusively on trading slaves. Prussia also held a colony at the island St. Thomas in the Caribbean, present-day part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, to which it could transport human cargo, and thus a transatlantic trade between the Prussian Gold Coast and the Caribbean was born. Years later, a treaty with the King of Arguin, an island off the western coast of Mauritania, now part of the Banque d'Arguin National Park, established a protectorate over that island, and Brandenburg occupied an abandoned fort originally constructed there by Portugal. Brandenburg, after 1701, the Kingdom of Prussia, pursued these colonial efforts until 1721, when Arguin was captured by the French, and the Gold Coast settlements were sold to the Dutch Republic. King Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia sold his Ghana Gross Friedrichsburg estates in Africa for 7,200 ducats, from which up to 30,000 people had been sold to the Dutch East India Company. The new owners, bound by contract, were to send 12 Negro boys, 6 of them decorated with golden chains, to the king. The enslaved children were brought to Potsdam and Berlin. The activity in Berlin had created awareness and the boiling ambition in the minds of Europeans to explore full-time on the enslavement of the black race, as a number of 18th century political and intellectual leaders began publicly to assert that Africans were naturally inferior and that they were indeed best suited for slavery. These deluded intellectuals revived an older image of all living things, that is, the scale of nature or great chain of being, to demonstrate that nature or God had made men unequal. This ancient hierarchical paradigm, encompassing all living creatures, starting with the simplest of organisms and reaching to humans, angels, and ultimately to God, became for the advocates of slavery a perfect reflection of the realities of inequality that they had created. The physical differences of blacks and Indians became the symbols or markers of their status. It was during these times that the term race became widely used to denote the ranking and inequality of these peoples. In other words, their placement on the chain of being. This apparently had stuck to their collective psyche as a people, and thus became the sole drive behind their entire impression, perspective, and every consideration and agenda towards the peoples of African descent. And was not the 18th century as well the very period the Berlin Conference was held concerning taking control over the black nations? Let's go further. In the second half of the 1800s, Germany suffered massive urban overcrowding due to its shift from an agrarian society to an industrialized nation. As it changed, Germany found itself in the throes of a concomitant population boom and rampant poverty. Low-priced American grain only exacerbated Germany's economic woes. Germans in large numbers were sleeping on city streets. The social upheaval ignited the so-called flight from the East. In the 1850s, desperate Germans boarded steamers with their luggages and their memories, immigrating to American shores. Some 215,000 came in the year 1854 alone. Things did not improve in Germany. In the 1880s still, another 1.5 million Germans came to America, bringing their beer and brats. Upon arrival to this country, they poured west into such centers as Milwaukee and St. Louis. It was an epic population influx for America that in large measure helped build the continental United States and the nation's social fabric. But in the Second Reich, rapid multi-million person population loss and the tearfully destitute conditions propelling the outflow were devastating to the German national identity. A concept arose, Volk ohne Raum, that is, a people without space. As the father of German geopolitics, Ratzel, with his post-Darwinian notions of racial supremacy, insisted that colonizing land to create extra living space was the cure for Germany's urban overcrowding. Lebensraum, he called it. In those tour of the 20th century days, a weakened Germany then turned its focus from the Balkans and the Slavic realms to Africa. Indeed, Ratzel wrote that Africa was an ideal candidate for the push to achieve Lebensraum, that is, living space. By the early 1880s, imperialists in England, Belgium, Portugal, France, and other countries were planning or had already inaugurated colonies throughout the African continent. Many were incomprehensibly brutal and exploitative regimes. Kaiser Wilhelm feared Germany would be shut out of Africa and its natural resources, including gold. The Second Reich enthusiastically joined in the fray, the so-called Scramble for Africa. The European race for colonialism made Germany start launching expeditions of its own, which frightened both British and French statesmen. Hoping to quickly soothe the brewing conflict, Belgian King Leopold II convinced France and Germany that common trade in Africa was in the best interests of all three countries. Under support from the British and the initiative of Portugal, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, called on representatives of 13 nations in Europe as well as the United States to take part in the Berlin Conference in 1884 to work out a joint policy on the African continent. Beginning in the year 1884, Germany convened the Berlin Conference of all the leading European powers of the day to cooperatively carve up the African continent. The Berlin Conference, also known as the Congo Conference or West Africa Conference, was held on the 15th of November, the year 1884, and after an adjournment concluded on the 26th of February 1885 with the signature of a general act regulating the European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period. The conference was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany at the request of King Leopold II. As part of the treaty, European governments also agreed to interdict and suppress the Arab slave trade, a lofty moralistic ideal with a double edge. Stemming Arab slave exports also kept able-bodied Africans on the land and available to labor in abject and cruel slave-like conditions on colonial plantations. However, the General Act of Berlin can be seen as the formalization of the scramble for Africa that was already in full swing. Out of that international conclave came an agreement enacted in the name of God Almighty that would systemize an orderly territorial invasion by European powers, as well as river navigation, land use, and the other needed rules for the future occupation of the coast of the African continent. At the conference, European states divided Africa into areas of influence which they would control. Germany controlled colonies in the African Great Lakes region and West Africa, from which numerous Africans migrated to Germany for the first time. Germany colonized 4 territories across the breadth of the continent: Togoland, the Cameroons, Tanganyika, and a main coastal presence in Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia. In Southwest Africa, German settlers were able to establish lucrative plantations by exploiting the labor of local Herero and Nama, also known as Hottentot, indigenous peoples. German banks and industrialists combined to provide needed economic support and investment. Berlin dispatched a small military contingent to protect white settlers as they confronted the lightly armed African natives considered subhuman in Germany's twisted notion of racial hierarchy. Once entrenched, the German minority established a culture of pure labor enslavement. Tribeswomen were subjected to incessant and often capricious rape, and not infrequently their men were killed while attempting to defend them. Whites routinely stole the possessions of natives, such as cattle, and found ways to seize ancestral lands over trivialities. Confiscation was often facilitated by predatory European lending practices enforced at gunpoint by the German military. In 1903, on the verge of utter dispossession, Nama warriors revolted against the 2,500-strong white community. Later, Herero fighters joined. Scores of German settlers were massacred in a sequence of surprise attacks. The 700-plus Schutztruppe, or protection force, was overwhelmed. The colonial governor called for reinforcements. In 1904, Berlin dispatched 14,000 soldiers to suppress the uprising. Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha, Supreme Commander of German Southwest Africa, had learned from other European battles in Africa, such as Britain's costly Boer War. Trotha was determined to quickly and completely exterminate the African natives, leaving the land free for fulfillment of the dream of Lebensraum. Armed with modern cannon and Gatling guns, Trotha's troops surrounded the Africans on 3 sides. When Trotha wrote on October 2, 1904, "It is my intention to destroy the rebellious tribes with streams of blood and money," his men used the German word Vernichtung. Vernichtung means extermination. After decimating the outclassed fighters, Trotha decided to annihilate the civilians as well. His proclamation to the Hereros and the colonists was an open pledge of extermination, unmistakable to all. These were his firmly spoken words: "I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Hereros. The Hereros are German subjects no longer. The Herero nation must now leave the country. If it refuses, I shall compel it to do so with the long tube," meaning cannon. Any Herero found inside the German frontier, with or without a gun or cattle, will be executed. I shall spare neither women nor children. I shall give the order to drive them away and fire on them. Such are my words to the Herero people. Understandably, Trotha's command became known in official circles as a Vernichtungsbefehl, that is, an extermination order. Nearly surrounded, more than 3,000 Hereros were cut down by fusillades. But bullets and cannon were only the beginning. German guide Jan Cloet testified, "I was present when the Herero were defeated in a battle in the vicinity of Waterberg. After the battle, all men, women, and children who fell into German hands, wounded or otherwise, were mercilessly put to death. Then the Germans set off in pursuit of the rest, and all those found by the wayside were shot down and bayoneted to death. The mass of the Herero men was unarmed and thus unable to offer resistance. They were just trying to get away with their cattle." To avoid staining the honor of German soldiers, von Trotha instructed his troops to fire over the heads of women, children, and weakened men, driving them east into the scorching dry Omaheke section of the Kalahari Desert. In anticipation of their flight, troops poisoned the wells or surrounded them with deadly forces. Starved of food or water, the desperate and weakened Herero wandered from watering hole to watering hole. Thousands in family groups gradually fell dead, their rib cages bulging to the limits of their gaunt and emaciated skins. Many who did not die quickly enough were seized, still whimpering, and then stacked by soldiers into human heaps atop makeshift pyres composed of bush branches and limbs. The people mounds of vanquished Hereros, still barely alive and breathing, were set on fire to finish the business. For many years, their mass-murdered bodies littered the desert in nightmarish aggregations of killed humanity. Whistled by the desert winds and photographed through the lens of eternity, flesh and bones became fleshless bones, as the unburied corpses not completely immolated were finally devoured by desert elements. A deadly fate also awaited the Nama tribespeople. Trotha sent them a similar message. The Nama who chooses not to surrender and lets himself be seen in German territory will be shot, until all are exterminated. It was a dance, a horrid dance, not at all one of civilization, but one of madness, of greed, and of lust for power. With the vast majority of the Africans murdered, Berlin rethought the extermination program. What good was maintaining a colony without a local workforce to exploit? Therefore, at some point, those civilian Herero and Nama people and related clans that managed to escape the bullets, cannon shot, killing thirst, and fiery execution were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. Many died on the long march. Others were simply transported to serve in cruel bondage for great German industrial concerns, building roads, berms, and useful holes for the German infrastructure. One of these camps was the notorious Shark Island concentration camp. For all intents and purposes, Shark Island was considered an extermination by labor camp where Nama and Herero civilians, including women and children, were knowingly and methodically worked to death. Investigators estimated the death rate at 90%, as thousands of defenseless Africans perished under the brutal living conditions, the heavy loads, the piercing elements, and the endless whippings with stinging sjambocks made of rhinoceros or hippopotamus hide, awaiting all those who showed either weakness, reluctance, or just slowness of step. A missionary recalled in shock, a woman who was so weak from illness that she could not stand, crawled to some of the other prisoners to beg for water. The overseer fired 5 shots at her. 2 shots hit her, one in the thigh, the other smashing her forearm. One surviving family member of a chief later testified to a British commission, "I was sent to Shark Island by the Germans. We remained on the island for 1 year. Approximately 3,500 Hottentots, Nama, and Kaffirs were sent to the island and only 193 returned. 3,307 died on the island." Another member of the German settlement wrote, "During the worst period, an average of 30 died daily. It was the way the system worked." General von Trotha publicly gave expression to this system of murder through work in an article he published. "The destruction of all rebellious tribes is the aim of our efforts." At the beginning of the German occupation, Herero society was estimated at about 80,000 to 90,000 souls. Some 50,000 Africans comprising other tribal groups created a total approximate native population of about 130,000 to 140,000. By the time the cannon smoke cleared and the injured stopped breathing, only about 15,000 broken Hereros remained to be dragooned for labor. In 1911, after hostilities had ceased and the extermination policy was challenged in Berlin, an official German census counted an 80% reduction of all tribal groups, or about 92,000 dead in the preceding few years. Settlement Commissioner Paul Rohrbach insisted, saying these words, "To secure the peaceful white settlement against the bad, culturally inept, and predatory native tribe, it is possible that its actual eradication may become necessary." Now tell me, please, who actually were the predators here, and who were the bad? Even still, Rohrbach bemoaned that so many sheep and cows had to die along with the Hereros, due to the sweeping nature of Trotha's Vernichtungsprinzip, or extermination policy. He chastised that it was a waste to lose that much livestock. Rohrbach did not at all feel nor mourn the brutal annihilation of humans just like himself. He instead mourned the loss of sheep, cows, livestock that were not even his own. What could be more inhumane? How else could animalian greed at its highest be described? Scholars commonly say that the Armenian genocide of the year 1914 to 1915, perpetrated by the Turks, was the first of the 20th century. That is wrong. History records that the first deliberate effort to systematically exterminate an entire group was by the Germans in Southwest Africa from the year 1904 to 1908. Yet the systematic slaughter of the Hereros and related African groups was hardly a secret genocide. The sanctioned extermination was long debated in the Reichstag. Was too much or too little force applied? In one 1906 Reichstag session, Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow read a newspaper letter explaining, "Around 2,000 Hereros are presently under German imprisonment. They surrendered against the guarantee of life, but were nevertheless transferred to Shark Island in Luderitz, where, as a doctor assured me, they will all die within 2 years due to the climate." Coveted medals were awarded to the military leaders. A heroic national myth was invented to glamorize the German conquest and victory, complete with grandiose horse-mounted soldier statuary in public squares both in Germany and Africa. Germany's military establishment compiled a 2-volume official report for study at its academies. The entire campaign was justified and elevated along numerous social and military planes. Published memoirs, artworks, and geopolitical promulgations enshrined the supposed gallantry of the extermination of the Hereros. How's that for some real thinking? After World War I, Germany was stripped of her African colonies as part of the Treaty of Versailles. German Southwest Africa and its other African colonies were set on a path to independence, albeit under close direct and indirect European tutelage. The loss of its colonies might have convinced many Germans that Africa was part of a dark past. Conscription and recruitment had been introduced into France's African territories decades earlier. Nearly 500,000 fearsome fighters, mainly from Senegal, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, all generally referred to as Senegalese tirailleurs, regardless of their national origins, fought in the French army in World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, in Article 428, stipulated that the Allies would occupy the Rhineland for 15 years. In 1919, French troops occupied this part of Western Germany. Between 20,000 and 40,000 of these occupying soldiers were Senegalese tirailleurs, about half from Arab North Africa and about half from Central and Interior Africa. The presence of African soldiers in authority caused hysteria in Germany and shock on both sides of the Atlantic. The people clearly had the disease of loathing what doesn't look like they are in color. Germans popularized a national panic over the so-called Black Horror on the Rhine. Deviant racial sexual imagery, including caricatures of monkey-like soldiers, often possessed of giant phalluses, ravaging helpless German damsels, spread widely in print and public discourse. By 1920, mass rallies had been convened in 25 German cities, including one with 50,000 attendees at Hamburg's Siegebiel Hall. Sympathetic rallies by German-American groups were organized across the United States by the American Campaign Against the Horror on the Rhine. One such demonstration at Madison Square Garden attracted 12,000 protesters of Irish and German descent. In the contentious presidential contest of 1920, some supporters of Warren G. Harding were fond of verbalizing support for his apparent promise that he would do his best to get those niggers out of Germany. Even Pope Benedict XV and his successor Pius XI voiced objection to African presence on German soil. Occupation by African soldiers was seen among the German people as a further wound-salting French humiliation of German honor and prestige. Certainly there were a number of rapes, but there were also consensual marriages as people mixed. From these came a class of mixed-race Afro-Germans popularly called mulattoes. Estimates vary widely, but many observers surmise some 20,000 mulattoes, that is, Afro-Germans with legal German citizenship, were now amongst them. Everywhere fear gripped German society that its racial superiority would be poisoned by Negro blood. The Black Horror on the Rhine coincided with the advent of American and international eugenics, a pseudoscience born on Long Island that found intellectual partnership with German racists of the day. Eugenics was an early 20th century American crusade to create a white, blonde, blue-eyed, Germanic utopian society that would rise following the systematic elimination of all people of color or of unwanted mixed ancestry. A famous founding document of the American movement was a 1912 German study, The Bastards of Rehoboth and the Problem of Miscegenation in Man, which claimed to document the corrupted moral and biological nature of black-white offspring. The author was German biologist and race scientist Eugen Fischer. He was stationed in colonial Southwest Africa, where he studied local Dutch African families cited in the work. From studies such as Fisher's sprang the fraudulent science of American eugenics that medicalized racial theory. Propelled by abundant financing from the Carnegie Institution, Harriman Railroad fortune, and Rockefeller Foundation, eugenics had ultimately led to the sterilization of some 60,000 Americans under laws in 27 states, as well as racial and ethnic incarceration. Carnegie and Rockefeller had poured millions of dollars into proliferating the pseudoscience in Germany after World War I. Average Germans everywhere embraced the American theories, elevating their visceral racial hatred into an entrenched university science with broad acceptance. The German and global public outcry against claimed biological and cultural debasement by French African troops finally got its way in May 1920, when Paris announced that its troops were almost entirely being transferred to the Mideast to fight the war against Arab nationalism in Syria. Germany once again thought its juncture with Africa was over. They were wrong. Thousands of French African soldiers returned in 1923. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed a massive $33 billion war debt on the newly established Weimar Republic, successor to the Second Reich. Germany struggled to pay its debt in cash and raw materials. When it defaulted on the delivery of 140,000 telegraph poles, thousands of French troops occupied Germany's Ruhr industrial region to seize the value of local factory output. German workers walked out on general strike. Berlin began printing worthless money to support the striking families, which led to the famous hyperinflation. With Germany roiled by socio-economic and political chaos and the fright of French African troops in many streets, the militarized rabble of Germany's recent wars rose again. They were determined to turn back the clock and achieve a racial and territorial triumph. The result of this was the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler. Nazi crimes, Hitler's henchmen, and their methodologies were well known, but their connection with Southwest Africa terrorism was less known. Many early Nazis served in the Schutztruppe, the military units that had operated in Southwest Africa. Recalling German colonial grandeur, Nazi stormtroopers purchased surplus Schutztruppe uniforms, light brown for service on the Kalahari Desert in the Southwest Africa realm. Hermann Göring rose as one of the Nazi triumvirate, second only to Hitler. The first Reichskommissar, or governor of German Southwest Africa, was Göring's father, Heinrich. The elder Göring was among the first to confront the Herero. For decades, a main street in the Southwest African settlement immortalized his name, Heinrich Göring Street. Franz Ritter von Epp was an early leading figure of the Third Reich. He formed the Freikorps Epp in 1919, which was one of the many street fighting units that evolved into the Nazis. Indeed, von Epp's personal aide was Ernst Röhm, who would later become a founding leader of the stormtroopers. Von Epp had hired a young informant named Adolf Hitler. Therefore, Hitler appointed von Epp Reichskommissar for Bavaria in 1933, and as such, von Epp was involved with the inauguration and oversight of Germany's first concentration camp, Dachau. During special ceremonial meetings with leaders such as Mussolini, von Epp was in photos next to Hitler or other ranking Nazis. He was one of the earlier volunteer German fighters in the Schutztruppe that fought the Herero in Southwest Africa. He served as a company commander under von Trotha and stayed on as concentration camps were established. Jürgen Fischer was the Nazi doctor who helped pioneer murderous eugenics in the Third Reich. As director of the Rockefeller Foundation-funded Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, Fischer steered racial pseudoscience into a war of extermination. In 1939, Fischer declared in a lecture, "When a people wants to preserve its own nature, it must reject alien racial elements, and when these have already insinuated themselves, it must suppress them and eliminate them. The Jew is such an alien, and therefore, when he wants to insinuate himself, he must be warded off. This is self-defense. In saying this, I do not characterize every Jew as inferior, as Negroes are, and I do not underestimate the greatest enemy with whom we have to fight." Fischer had launched his career in race science with a study of interbreeding between the Nama and Dutch settlers. Working arduously in such concentration camps as Shark Island, Fischer ordered hundreds of executed inmates to be decapitated. In the opinion of a sane mind, Fischer was a lunatic far from disguise. He would order Herero women to remove all flesh from their heads using shards of glass, to create clean skulls suitable for shipment. These were then packed in crates and sent back to Berlin for Fischer's eugenic examination at nameplate German scientific institutes on whether they were actually humans or not. So celebrated were these skull shipments that a popular color postcard sporting a photograph of the packing process was published in Germany in commemoration of the ghastly endeavor. The racial view that Africans were actually not humans, but rather subhumans, first appeared in German usage in Southwest Africa. It was von Trotha who archetypically wrote, "A humane war cannot be waged against those who are not human." Southwest African colonial officials and military men had taken to the view that the hereros were actually a form of baboon or other monkey, but not human. One German in Southwest Africa wrote, "We should burn all these baboons." African people were commonly thought of as talking monkeys by many eugenicists worldwide at the time. There was no feeling whatsoever for whoever died or suffered, whether children or adults, men or women, inasmuch as they were on a black skin. The Nazi regime had risen with extreme difficulties and persecutions on the people of color to ensure racial purity by their marginalization and possibly extermination. Horrible measures were taken to this effect. These were a set of anti-Semitic laws enacted in Nazi Germany in 1935. They were named after the city of Nuremberg, where the annual Nazi Party rallies took place. There were two main components to the Nuremberg laws. The first was the Reich Citizenship Law. This law deprived Jews of their German citizenship and reclassified them as subjects of the state. It also defined who was considered a citizen of the Reich, that is, empire, based on German bloodlines. Only individuals with German or related blood were granted citizenship rights. The second component was the law for the protection of German blood and honor. This law prohibited marriages and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews. It also forbade the employment of German females under the age of 45 in Jewish households. The aim was to prevent racial contamination and preserve the purity of German blood. The Nuremberg laws institutionalized discrimination against Jews, Africans, and Afro-Germans, depriving them of their rights, separating them from the rest of German society. These laws laid the groundwork for further persecution, including the confiscation of properties, exclusion from public life, and ultimately, the infamous genocide of the Jews. The Nazi regime implemented forced sterilization programs as part of their eugenics agenda in continued marginalization directed at Africans. In 1933, Nazi officials subjected hundreds of thousands of blacks and Afro-German children in the Rhineland to forced sterilization. Afro-Germans were called Rhineland bastards, a derogatory term coined by Germans to describe the children German women had from some of the black soldiers who were stationed in the Rhineland during its occupation by France after World War I. Along with the Jews, Afro-Germans were considered enemies of the race-based state, who were to be segregated and eventually exterminated through compulsory sterilization. Hans Hauck, the son of an Algerian soldier and a white German, one amongst the very many who underwent the operation, appeared in the 1997 documentary, Hitler's Forgotten Victims. He spoke about how he was taken in secret to have a vasectomy. He was then given a sterilization certificate to allow him to carry on working, and he had to sign an agreement saying he would not marry or have sex with people with German blood. It was depressing and oppressive, he told the documentary makers. I felt only half human. Another victim, Thomas Holzhauser, said on the film, "Sometimes I'm glad I couldn't have children. At least they were spared the shame I lived with." Very few others spoke about their experiences while they were alive, and there have not been many attempts to uncover what eventually happened to the majority of them. Mr. Aitken, who is one of the few historians working on the subject, told the BBC. It is worthwhile remembering that the Nazis also willfully destroyed many of the documents pertaining to camps and to sterilization, making it difficult to reconstruct the fates of groups and individuals, he said. Living had become extremely terrifying during the Nazi period for Afro-Germans and all African descents, as their passports were all confiscated. Working conditions and traveling were made extremely difficult for Afro-German musicians, circus or film professionals. Based on racist propaganda, employers were unable to retain or hire Afro-German employees. Once war broke out in 1939, their position became more precarious. People in mixed relationships could be targeted for sterilization, imprisonment, or murder. Endlösung. That was what the Nazis called it, the German word suggestive of extermination. The Nazis had earlier spoken of the final solution to the native question, which would be to break their power totally and for all time. Endlösung was the code for such, used for the first time in 1904 by George Hartmann, manager of the Southwest Africa Company, in the preparation of a special report concerning the erasure of the Herreros, decades before the Third Reich. The Nazis had only begun to implement that report in 1942. The Third Reich had, to that effect, established thousands of concentration camps and sub-camps where so many Jews and blacks were seized and taken to, most of whom were industrially killed, experimented on, worked to death. Heinrich Himmler, a Hitler-trusted ally, had ordered a census of all the black people living in Germany at the time, shortly after which over 2 dozens and counting into thousands of Afro-Germans and other Africans ended up evidently in the concentration camps alongside millions of Jews. People would simply just disappear and you wouldn't know what happened to them, said Elizabeth Morton, whose parents ran an African entertainment troupe in the documentary Hitler's Forgotten Victims. There was no plan of bringing this to a halt in the nearest future. The incarceration, the lynchings, slavish labors, cruel experimentations, as the final solution for Germany was the extermination of its black population. Shortly after, on the first day of the month of May 1945, the unexpected news of Hitler's death was announced on German radio. Hitler had committed suicide by gunshot to the temple of his head on the 30th of April 1945 in the Führerbunker in Berlin after it became clear that Germany would lose the Battle of Berlin, which led to the end of World War II in Europe. Eva Braun, his wife of one day, also committed suicide, taking cyanide. Their remains had been burned in accordance with Hitler's prior instructions that afternoon. But this did little to halt the intense criminal inhuman operations at the concentration camps until years later, as the rabid racist hate for the black nations by Germany was a nature. That brings us to the end of this video. If you learned something new, encourage us by liking, sharing, and subscribing. To keep the channel growing, thank you for watching.